Hello and welcome to Aero Innovations. I'm Aero and I'll be your host this evening. So I know I haven't posted in a while, but you know how they have workaholics? Well, then there's me. I kinda enjoy not working. That's what the summer is all about. That's why I gave you guys a massive summer promotion so you can enjoy the summer along with me. But eventually, all good things must come to an end. But to make things up to you guys, I have a super exciting episode for you today. We're gonna be doing something different. In today's vlog, I'm going to show you each and every single hand that I get dealt. I'm going to mostly do a lot of folding, but any hand that looks somewhat playable, I'll give you my reasoning why I decide to play it or fold it in a particular position. If you're looking to crush low stakes, no limit hold'em, then you've come to the right place. Normally I play 2-5 at the Wynn Encore in Las Vegas, where I buy in for $1,500, which is 300 big blinds. But tonight, since this video will mostly be geared towards beginning audiences, I'll be playing 1-3 and buying in for $500. It's Friday night on August 22nd. We start the session at 11:27 p.m. So the very first hand, I get dealt a very playable 4-5 of spades in the cutoff. Under the gun opens for 6. The middle position and low jack both call. Suddenly, the hijack 3-bets to an unsavory $50. This is just going to be a fold 7 days a week for this amount. There's no situation in which I would ever call here with this hand, regardless of how deep we are. Even if 4-5 suited is your lucky hand, like maybe you have a kid born on April 5th, or you're really into Star Wars, May the 4th is not going to be with you for $50, man. If you truly want to become a successful poker player, you need to stop believing in lucky hands, and learn what hands you can play, for what amounts and in what positions. 3-9 offsuit is just a fold. Deuce-5 offsuit is a fold. Queen-3 is a fold. Here we finally get to play our first hand. I open to 15 in the +1 with King-Queen of clubs. The action folds around to the big blind who puts in the call. What's interesting is he then shoots out a $25 dark bet. That means he's betting before we even get to see the flop. This is highly unusual in a 1-3 game, especially when he's not the preflop aggressor. This most likely designates him as an action player. So the flop comes 3-8-4 with 2 clubs and a diamond. We flop 2 overs with a king-high flush draw. This is actually a much better than average flop. Since our opponent bet in the dark, there's a very good chance he either has nothing at all or not a whole lot. We have a 55% chance to win this hand by the river against any one pair holding that isn't holding a club. This applies all the way up to pocket jacks. Rather than just calling here and being forced to improve, I want to use fold equity to potentially take down this pot. I played my big draws very aggressively, so I raised the price of poker up to $75. Our opponent quickly puts in the call. The turn brings in a 9 of diamonds, putting 2 diamonds on board to go along with the 2 clubs. At first, this might not look like a very good card. It's not a king, it's not a queen, and it's not a club. However, I want to try to change the way you think. Try to look at things from our opponent's perspective. He bet 25 in the dark, which into a pot of 31 is a very strong bet. We raised him to 75, which is no weak raise in 1-3 standards. He's sitting there with a stack of about 150 behind. So when this 9 of diamonds peels off, which is an overcard to the 8, and I go all in for the remainder of his stack, what sorts of hands am I representing? This should almost always be an overpair, right? So if you're sitting there with a hand like pocket 6s or pocket 7s, or even that flopped 8, and you face this sort of action, what would you do? Most of the time, you're going to be looking at between 2 to 5 outs to improve versus an overpair, right? Even if our opponent were to make this call, we would still have between 14 to 15 outs to improve against the majority of 1-pair holdings, which is still roughly 33% equity. Risking 150 to win the pot of 181 with that sort of equity still gives us the correct pot odds to be profitable in the long term. If you're wondering how that math works, well, if our opponent calls our shove for 150, the new pot will then be 481. We will be risking 150 to win a pot of 481, which is less than our 33% equity. But thankfully, we won't have to worry about that, as our opponent quickly makes the fold. We profit a quick $90 from this hand without even seeing a river or being forced to improve. That's how you effectively use fold equity to win a pot. Ace-3 offsuit is just a fold. Deuce-9 is a fold. For this hand, the cutoff limps. It's the same opponent from the last hand. I'm in the small blind with Ace-King offsuit. Although this is a great starting hand, you only have about a 1 in 3 chance of hitting a favorable flop. If I were on the button, I would probably only bump this up to about 15 or 18 or so. But since I'm in the small blind, I want to give myself a chance to take down the dead money without seeing a flop, and also limit the number of players in the hand, so I raise the action up to 25. The big blind quickly gets out of the way, but the cutoff makes the call. We already have him designated as an action player, so we suspected this would be the most likely outcome. We go heads up, out of position, to flop of deuce 9-7 with 2 diamonds. We don't flop anything at all. This is not a very good flop for our range or our actual hand. We could bet small here against a tighter opponent, but I get the impression this particular player is very sticky. We already represented an overpair in the last hand we played against him only a few minutes ago, so our credibility is probably a little bit lower against him. So with all of this in mind, I start with a check. Thankfully, our opponent checks the action back. The turn brings in a 3 of diamonds, putting 3 diamonds on board. We still have some showdown value with ace high. We might have the very best hand right now. Since we're not holding a single diamond, I check again. Unfortunately, our opponent decides to stick in his entire stack into our face with an all-in shove for over $100. This is a pretty dramatic overbet. I suspect we have the best hand right now with our ace high. I think our opponent still only has a flush draw, but in the off chance he has a single pair, we'd be completely crushed, even if he doesn't have a diamond. And if he did have a diamond to go along with his pair, like for instance, let's say he's holding ace deuce or ace 3 offsuit with the ace of diamonds, then we'd be completely nuked down to 2 outs, praying for a non-diamond king on the river. In the unlikely event our opponent has 2 pairs or better, we'd be drawing just plain dead. So even though I suspect our opponent only has a naked flush draw here, it's just not worth it. We can find a better spot. So I make a very reasonable fold, only to have our opponent proudly flip over his king 10 offsuit with the king of diamonds. He risked double the amount in the pot with 1 card to go on a flush draw that isn't even the ace high draw. Alright, good to know. I guess our assessment that he was an action player was dead on the ball. The very next hand, +1 opens to 10. The hijack calls. I'm on the button with pocket 7s. Some poker pros and many poker vloggers might often 3-bet here, but with such a small pocket pair, especially in a 1-3 game where players are much less likely to fold, I prefer to simply call and try to set mine, so that's what I do. The flop comes 8, ace 4 with 2 spades, +1 c-bets for 15. The hijack folds. We're facing a slightly under half pot bet into a pretty dynamic board with 2 spades, so I think my opponent doesn't necessarily always have an ace here. A lot of 1-3 players c-bet just to c-bet, so I decide to call once to see what happens on the turn since I do have position. The turn brings in a queen of hearts. Again, my opponent leads, but only for 20 into a pot of 64. If I were actually on the flush draw, I would be getting an amazing price. Unfortunately, I am not in fact on a flush draw, and at this point I think my opponent really does have an ace, so I put in the fold. And my opponent is kind enough to show he was in fact holding an ace. The very next hand, the action folds around to me in the cutoff where I look down at jack queen offsuit. If my position were any earlier, I would just fold. This is not a very good hand, but since I have a really good position here, instead of folding, I open to 10. Everyone else folds and I pick up the blinds. Position is incredibly powerful, and you need to learn how to use it effectively if you want to be consistently profitable at no limit hold'em. Here we look down at king deuce of spades in the low jack. The action folds around to us. Even though it's suited, there's no compatibility between the king and the deuce. We'll be the first into the pot, and anyone who calls behind us will have position on us. Even if we hit a flush, it most likely won't be the nut flush, so this is just a fold. If I had been on the button, this would instead be a $10 raise. The very next hand, under the gun and +1 limp. I raise to 20 in the low jack with pocket 8s. I'm putting in a larger raise than I would normally with this hand, 1 because of the 2 limpers, and 2 because I'm trying to dissuade anyone from calling behind so that I can maintain position. Unfortunately, my plan fails when the button calls. The big blind calls as well, but the 2 limpers both fold. We go 3 ways to flop of deuce 4-4 with 2 diamonds and a club. Big blind checks to me. On a board this low, I consider this a pretty polarizing flop. It's very possible our opponents could have flopped complete air. If one of our opponents is holding a 4, pocket deuces, or a pair bigger than ours, then we're drawing incredibly thin. On the other hand, if we're currently holding the largest pair, it's both of our opponents who are drawing incredibly thin. You don't need to bet super strong on this sort of board. So I put in a continuation bet of 20 into the pot of 66. The button makes the call, but the big blind folds. The turn brings in a deuce of clubs, putting 2 clubs on board to go along with the 2 diamonds, but I think that's pretty irrelevant on a double paired board. I think the odds of our opponent holding a random deuce here when I raise to 20 preflop is pretty minuscule. Plus, if he were holding a 4, he would most likely have raised on the flop already, since I bet pretty small into a board with 2 diamonds. Low stakes players are usually terrified of boards with 2 to a suit, so I think there's a good chance we're still ahead here. I ramp up my bet sizing and throw out a bet of 50 into the pot of 106. Yes, it's a double paired board, and yes, I'm absolutely crushed if our opponent has either a 4 or a 2. But spots like this is when deductive reasoning comes into play. You need to learn how to properly range your opponents based upon certain factors, such as how large a raise was pre-flop, how they respond to certain bet sizes on a wet or dry board, and also how tight or loose your opponent is if you have that sort of information. Here, I've deduced that it's incredibly unlikely for my opponent to be holding either a deuce or a 4. So when I suddenly face a huge raise to 150 from the button who's sitting there with a stack of about 300, I think this is a whole lot of hogwash. I mean, sure, you could raise here with a 4 if we were playing higher stakes, because you want to build the pot, but I think low stakes players are heavily weighted towards slow playing when they're essentially holding the nuts. So with all of that in mind, I make a pretty easy call. The river brings in a 3 of diamonds, completing the front door flush. Ace 5 and 5-6 suited also make straights as well. Other than that, the river shouldn't change much. Our opponent was already representing a full house. There's no reason for me to do anything other than check, although I fully intend to snap call if my opponent were to shove here. I wasn't calling a $100 raise on the turn on a double paired board if I wasn't planning on calling another 150 on the river. Calling that $100 raise on the turn, hoping and praying to hit an 8 on the river would just be nonsensical. So the pot is now over $400, and my opponent only has about 150 behind. I think he realizes he doesn't have any chance of trying to steal this pot from me, so he decides to just give up and check behind. I table my hand, and he's shocked to see I'm only holding pocket 8s. They're good, and I win a pretty substantial pot. Up $246 only 20 minutes into the session. Hopefully, if you watch enough of my videos, you can learn how to better range your opponents as well. And if you need even further assistance, I do provide poker coaching on my Patreon page as well, along with one-on-one private coaching too. 9-3 suited is just a fold. Here I have Jack Queen offsuit again, but since I'm in early position, this is just a fold. King 9 offsuit under the gun is a fold. 5-9 offsuit in the big blind is not worth defending against a raise. Oh, would you looky here? It's pocket aces. Pocket freaking rocket. The Jet Li of live action poker. Here the cutoff limps. It's the action player from earlier with the King 10 offsuit who called our $25 preflop raise. I'm in the small blind again, just like I was earlier with Ace King, except here, our hand isn't nearly as vulnerable. Since we only have the big blind yet to act, there's no need to raise this hand into oblivion, so I raise the action up to $17. Yes, I realize I'm raising different amounts dependent upon my hand strength. You may have heard you need to keep your raises balanced to hide the strength of your hand. Well, I'm here to tell you that's all complete and utter nonsense in the low stakes. Playing balanced is for scrubs. We are not utilizing GTO. We are not playing online. We are playing exploitatively to make the absolute max from low stakes cash players. Low stakes players are rarely paying attention to who is raising and to what amounts. They usually are only looking at the strength of their own hand. So for my modest $17 raise, the big blind and cutoff both call. The flop comes deuce, 9, deuce, rainbow. This is an absolutely delicious flop. There are no straight or flush draws of any kind. Any naked 9 or pocket pair only has 2 outs against our hand. There is some chance one of our opponents could be holding a hand like ace deuce here, but considering we're holding 2 of the aces, that makes that probability extremely unlikely. Again, this is what's known as a polarizing flop, and a flop like this is just about as polarizing as it gets. Since I don't have a whole lot to be afraid of, and I kind of want one of our opponents to catch up in case they're holding 2 random overcards, I start with a very deceptive check. The big blind checks as well, but thankfully the cutoff falls for our trap and proceeds with a half pot size bet of 25 into the pot of 54. I'm loving that bet. Even if he did somehow wake up with the deuce here, I don't think he would have used such a large bet sizing on such an incredibly dry board. You might be tempted to check raise here, but I don't see the point. Trapped between 2 opponents, the best course of action is just a call. So that's what I do, and the big blind gets out of the way. The turn brings in a very beautiful 3 of diamonds, putting 2 diamonds on board. Perfect! It's not a pesky overcard to scare our opponent away. I check again. This time he puts in a very underwhelming bet of 30 into the now bloated pot of 104. He has about 120 behind. There's no reason to slow play any longer, so I just shove all in for the remainder of his stack. Our opponent puts in the call. I immediately flip over my aces since I'm the aggressor and I don't want to slow roll him. The river brings in a queen of spades. My opponent turns over his hand to reveal 6-9 of spades, so we're good. See, this is why I folded ace-king earlier even though I suspected I was up against a naked flush draw. That spot was pretty shady, and I didn't have to wait very long for a much better one. Queen 7 offsuit is a fold. Jack queen offsuit in the cutoff is a pretty decent hand, but facing a raise of 15 is just a fold. Ace 9 off is a fold. 4-5 off is a fold. Queen 5. Queen 7. King 3. Jack 4 suited under the gun is a fold. Queen 5 suited in the small blind facing a $15 raise is not worth defending. Ace 9 off on the button facing a $10 raise is just a fold. Sorry to say, but even the suited 49ers is not worth limping. Forget defending for a $15 raise. Here, there's an under the gun straddle. I open to 21 in the hijack with king queen offsuit. Only the cutoff calls, which is unfortunate because we lose position. The flop comes 5 ace jack with 2 diamonds. We flop nothing but a gut shot and a prayer. If we had position here and our opponent checked, I would throw out a small c-bet. But since we're out of position, I start with a check. Thankfully, our opponent checks back. So you're saying there's a chance. The turn brings in a 3 of spades. It puts 2 spades on board to go along with the 2 diamonds. I could check again and give up on the pot, but I decide to take the initiative and lead with a strong pot size bet of 40 into the pot of 52. I'm hoping to get hands like pocket 10s or a naked jack to fold. We're also still technically ahead of both the flush draws. Unfortunately, my opponent isn't going to make this easy for us as he puts in the call. The river brings in a 9 of spades. The backdoor flush draw gets there, so here I have the option to either give up on the pot or try to rep that backdoor flush. Not having position here really sucks. If my opponent had checked to me, I would smash the sphincter out of this river with a bet of like 200 or so. But it would suck to make such a bet and run into a flush, because he's never folding. I think I can get a weak ace or any jack to fold with a pot size bet though, so I lead with a bet of 110 into the pot of 132. Here, my opponent tanks, which is never a good sign. I was hoping for a quick fold. Unfortunately, after 45 seconds of deliberation, he does eventually put in the call. I proudly table our king high, and he turns over ace queen, which is a much stronger hand than I put him on. Usually that sort of hand would bet the flop with 2 diamonds on board. See, not all of my bluffs get through, and not all of my reads are correct. That's why this episode is designed to show you each and every single hand that I play, so you guys can see the whole picture. Then you can decide for yourself if my content is worth watching. The very next hand, under the gun straddles to 6. It's our nemesis from tonight with the 6-9 of spades from earlier as well as the king 10. I raise the action up to 16 in the +1 with ace 5 of spades. Everyone else folds, but he puts in the call. We go heads up in position to flop of king 3 jack with a spade and 2 diamonds. We don't flop anything at all except a couple of backdoor draws and a dream. However, when our opponent checks, we can very easily represent this board. Unlike when the flop was deuce 9-7 earlier, this flop is actually very much in our range, even if it doesn't hit our actual hand. Plus, we might still be ahead against 2 random straddle cards. So I throw out a very tiny c-bet of $11 into the $36 pot. Instead of his usual snap decisions, our opponent puts in a noticeable delay before making this very tiny call. Alright, I guess he doesn't have a whole lot either. The turn brings in another king, putting 3 diamonds on board. This time, our opponent leads with a bet of 20 into the pot of 58. If he didn't have a king on the flop, how can this king possibly improve his hand? I suspect his hand has only just improved to include the backdoor diamond draw. I'm getting a lot of weird deja vu vibes though. So we know what sort of hand he most likely has, so now the question is, what are we going to do about it? I know I only have ace high, and it's ace garbage for that matter, but that's pretty irrelevant. What matters is our opponent has no idea what we're holding, while we most likely know what sort of hand he has. So I put in a raise to 65. This time, our opponent quickly makes the call. Alright, so as long as the river behaves, we can unload the clip with a 3-barrel bluff. Unfortunately, the river brings in another king. I mean, it's not a diamond. We could still be good here, right? That thought flies right out the window when our opponent suddenly shoves for over $300. Well, there goes that plan. I have no choice but to fold. Thinking he'd bluffed me, our opponent proudly flips over ace-10 offsuit with the ace of diamonds for the missed flush draw we suspected he was holding. Okay, I don't advise mimicking his play. If I did have a king, or heck, even a jack there, I would have snap called. He risked $300 to get me off of a chop, because in this very rare instance, I was actually betting with squadouche. For informational purposes, had the river been some random small card, we would never be able to get trip kings to fold there regardless of price. It would be extremely pricey to try to even get a jack to fold as well. So I would have targeted a missed ace-high flush draw, which still very much has us beat considering our pathetic kicker, and try to get him to fold with a bet for like $50. In situations like that, a smaller bluff on the river is more profitable long term than a large bluff. You risk less to win the same amount, and both bets are just as effective if you're targeting a missed draw. The very next hand, I open to 10 in the middle position with king-queen offsuit. Only the small and big blinds call. We go three ways in position to flop of ace-4-4 rainbow. Again, this is a very polarizing flop. Both opponents check it over to me. We may very well have the best hand right now. I throw out a very small c-bet of another stagnant $10. Both opponents fold, and we take this one down. 3-4 off is a fold. 8 deuce suited. 5-7 off. Here, there's an under the gun straddle. Small blind calls. I call for $3 more with jack 6 of spades in the big blind. The flop comes 9, king, ace, rainbow. The action gets checked around to the straddle, who throws out a pot-sized bet of 15 into the $18 pot. Nothing to do here but fold. 5-6 off, 10-8 off on the button facing a $40 raise is an easy fold. Jack 9 off. Here, the middle position opens to 10 with a $700 stack. The low jack calls. I call in the hijack with jack queen off because I have a good position. Suddenly, the cutoff 3 bets to 60. Oh well, time to fold. Here, I open to 15 in the low jack with king queen offsuit. If my position were any earlier, I might open to only 10 or 12 to get a better sense of how strong people are behind me. The last thing I would want is to get trapped by a better starting hand like ace king or ace queen. Flopping top pair and getting out-kicked would be disastrous. Remember that hand earlier when I tried to bluff with king queen offsuit? I tried to represent the backdoor spade draw and got called down by ace queen. Well, that hand would have actually been much worse if we had flopped queen high. In the end, king queen isn't all that great of a hand. Try to remember that before you end up losing stacks with an often dominated hand. Anyways, here only the small blind makes the call. The flop comes 5, deuce 5 with 2 hearts. It's one of those very polarizing flops. Our opponent is most likely going to miss these flops most of the time. So when he starts with a check, I put in a very tiny $10 c-bet and take it down. Let's say instead of king queen, I had open raise with a hand like 7-8 suited. I would still put in the same tiny c-bet and get most better hands that also completely break the flop to fold. I mean, it's just not very profitable long term to defend a flop like this with a hand like 10 jack of clubs or ace 10 for instance. You're going to be out of position against the preflop aggressor. If you decide to float out of position here with 2 random overcards, you'll have to fold to future streets of aggression, and sometimes, even when you do end up turning something, you end up losing even more money. That's why it's so profitable to be aggressive in position. You can get a lot of better hands to fold depending upon certain runouts and how your opponent reacts. The information you gain from having position is incredibly valuable. Queen 8 is a fold. 10-6 suited is garbage. Try not to get into the habit of playing triple gapper suited cards. There's a $15 raise from the cutoff, so I just fold in the big blind. 8-5 is a fold. 9 deuce. 9 queen. Queen 3. 10 deuce. Props to Doyle, but don't play this garbage. Here, under the gun limps. Most of the time, I will limp behind with small pocket pairs like these pocket 5s, but here I make a small raise to 10 in the middle position. I'm almost 200 big blinds deep since I've been winning, and you also need to very occasionally randomize your limp and raising range to keep opponents on their toes. The cutoff, button, and under the gun limper all call. The flop comes jack, queen, ace, rainbow. When the under the gun player checks, I'm not about to bluff into 3 other players on a board with 3 overcards and a potential straight, so I just check as well, and the action checks around to the button, who throws out a very small third pot bet of 15. That's enough to get everyone to fold. The very next hand, I open to 8 under the gun with ace-8 of clubs. It's just a very small little pot sweetener in case I flop something monstrous. This type of hand is in the same caliber as a small pocket pair, and it's what I like to call a speculative hand. Either you completely break the flop and invest very little, realizing that your hand isn't worth anything, or you flop the world and strike gold. So here, the hijack, cutoff, and big blind all call. And boom! Just like that, the flop comes 4-8-8 with 2 diamonds. We flop trip 8s with an ace kicker. Big blind checks. I start with an incredibly small c-bet of 10 into the pot of 33. Same as I would with the vast majority of my hands when betting into these small paired boards that I call polarized flops. As you've seen me do previously, if nobody has anything, I can often take down these sorts of flops with very little resistance and very little interest. But here, the cutoff and big blind both call. The turn brings in a 9 of clubs. Big blind checks again. With 2 callers, I can almost be certain that one of them is on that flush draw, and the other might be on a straight draw of some kind. That 9 improves some straight draw possibilities, in case someone were holding a hand like 6-7 for instance. Now, we know what sorts of hands our opponents are holding. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Should we throw out another tiny third pot bet? Absolutely not. I smash the pot with a strong bet of 50. The cutoff folds, but the big blind calls. If that river brings in a diamond, it had better be the ace of diamonds. So the river comes, and it's neither an ace or a diamond. It's the jack of clubs. Under the gun checks for a third time. Okay, so 7-10 makes a straight, but unless our opponent were very specifically holding 7-10 of diamonds, we shouldn't be afraid of that jack. It's a relatively safe card. A naked 4 would not have called our big bet of 50 on the turn. Therefore, the only logical conclusion is our opponent has a missed draw of some kind. Either that, or he's playing super meek with a weaker 8. There's no point targeting a missed flush draw with the river bet. They're likely to fold to the tiniest of bets, and that's not what we want. We want to target the top portions of his range, like a weaker 8, or a missed flush draw that contains either a 9 or a jack. So with that in mind, I throw out another pot-sized bet of 150 into the pot of 163. Our opponent quickly makes the call. We show him the bad news, and he turns over 10 jack of diamonds to show how big of a draw he actually had. Did you see how I was able to mentally evaluate what sorts of hands my opponent is holding using proper bet sizing? Earlier, on that 4-4 double paired board, I was also able to deduce that my opponent at that time was bluffing. And then now, on this hand, I was able to extract a very large bet from my opponent by targeting the top portions of his range. Once you start using proper bet sizes, you can get better practice at properly ranging your opponents. The very next hand, the hijack limps. Everyone else folds, the small blind completes, and I check my option in the big blind with 6-4 offsuit. The flop comes deuce, 8-5, rainbow. We flop a very sneaky double gut shot draw. A 3 or a 7 will give us a straight. Small blind checks. I want to give myself a chance at winning this pot without needing to improve. And if we do in fact improve, I want to win a bigger pot. So I start with a $5 bet into this $9 pot. The limper folds, but the small blind makes the call. The turn is the 10 of spades, keeping the board rainbow. We don't make a straight, but overcards are definitely appreciated when you want to continue semi-bluffing. The small blind checks again. I ramp up my bet sizing to 20, which is a slight overbet into the $19 pot. We don't want to waste the opportunity to use this overcard. We don't want to be put into a position where we're forced to improve to win. A strong bet of this magnitude can get lots of hands like a 5, pocket 6s, or even a modest 8 to fold. And surely enough, it gets the job done, as small blind puts in the fold, and we take down the pot with 6 high. The very next hand, I look down at King Jack offsuit in the small blind. The low jack and hijack both limp. The cutoff raises to 20. Holding a dominated hand in the small blind, this is just a super easy fold for this price. The most I'm willing to call is probably a tiny raise to no larger than 10. This is where a large portion of you guys mess up. You look down at King Jack and you think it's a good hand. News alert, it's not. Especially not for a $20 raise, and especially not from the small blind. Heck, I wouldn't even call with this hand on the button, facing a $15 raise. If you learn anything from my videos, try to remember this lesson. For educational purposes, I'll tell you what happens after I fold. The low jack limper calls the $20 raise. The hijack suddenly limp raises to 90. which makes absolutely no sense at all given his late position. The cutoff folds, but here's where things get interesting. The low jack, who had only limp called the $20 raise, suddenly backjam 4 bets all in for just over $500. The hijack folds and the low jack shows pocket kings. People in the low stakes just love trapping and limping monsters. If I had called that $20 raise, not that I would ever do such a thing, but I would have wasted $20. And if I had ever gotten frisky and 3-bet my hand from the small blind, again, not that I ever would, but I would have wasted whatever nonsense 3-bet I would have made. I don't know why, but some of these other low stakes vloggers like to pull random frisky moves for absolutely no reason whatsoever. I'm sure you know which ones I'm talking about. I mean, don't get me wrong, I pull a whole lot of bluffs, but my bluffs are usually deep-rooted in reason, and usually only if I ever sense weakness. Don't get into the habit of 3-betting light, especially in the low stakes cash games. Here under the gun opens to 20. Even though Queen 5 suited seems tempting on the button, this is just a fold. For this hand, under the gun opens to 15. With Deuce 4 suited, this is just a fold, even in the cutoff. Here I open to 15 in the low jack with Ace Jack of Hearts. Only our old nemesis calls in the small blind. I have since changed seats to get a better camera view of the table, so he's across from us now. The flop comes 8, King 9, with 2 spades and a diamond. Small blind checks. If the flop had been King Deuce 4 or something similar, I might consider c-betting, but we all know how sticky this player can get. He might continue for multiple streets with as weak of a hand as bottom pair, or a backdoor draw of some sort. We don't really want to get into the habit of triple barrel bluffing against action players. So here I decide to check the action back and see what transpires on the turn. So the turn comes, and it brings in yet another king, pairing top pair. Our opponent decides to lead this time with a half-pot bet of 15. This guy isn't the sort of guy to ever check top pair on the flop, so there's no way he has a king here. We might win by hitting a jack, we might win by hitting an ace, but if nothing else, we have position, so I make the call. The river brings in a 6 of clubs, which doesn't help us whatsoever. What's worse, our opponent comes out betting this time to the tune of $50. Time to throw in the towel, right? Except this opponent has shown what he thinks is 2 big all-in bluffs against us so far, and the only hand that we've ever shown him that has gone to showdown was pocket aces. If you factor that in, plus the fact that I think he only has a 9 here at the very most, I put in a toe-curling raise to 200. My opponent doesn't immediately fold, so then I start the speech play.
You got that king, I know, at least.
Good bet, sir. I have a pocket pair that's not gonna...
Our ploy works, and our opponent makes the fold. And since he's been so nice to show us bluffs all night, I figure I would return the favor and do the same. Jack Queen off in early position is a fold. So here, the under the gun and hijack players limp. The cutoff makes an extremely small raise to 10. The button folds, but the small blind makes the call. If the raise had come from an earlier position player, I would have just called here with my pocket 8s, since I have terrible position in the big blind. But since I recognize that the raise was incredibly weak, especially when you factor in that 2 players had already limped, I decide to play my hand more aggressively to potentially take down the dead money. I 3-bet to 45. Surely enough, everyone folds. Aside from proper bet sizing, another useful tool to have in your arsenal is recognizing when someone else's bet is a bit too weak and telegraphs the strength of their hand. The very next hand, the button opens to 10 with the $900 stack. In my usual 2-5 deep stack game, I would recognize this as a button isolation raise against the blinds. But this is 1-3. 1-3 players usually don't employ that strategy. They're weighted way more heavily towards limping to see flops. Plus, this is the same opponent who called my king-queen bluff earlier with his ace-queen even after flopping top pair on a really wet board. He checked back that flop, so that leads me to believe he's a pretty tight player. So with ace-4 of spades in the small blind, I just make the call, and the big blind calls as well. We go to a flop, which is 3 ace-9 with 2 hearts and a club. Since I'm out of position, I start with a check. Big blind checks as well, and the button throws out a $15 continuation bet. There's a good chance I'm not good here against a tight player, but I can't fold top pair just yet, so I make the call, and big blind gets out of the way. The turn brings in a 9 of hearts, pairing the board, and also completing the flush draw. Not my favorite card. I check again. My opponent does not slow down. and in fact ramps up his aggression with a $50 bet into the $60 pot. I can't beat an ace, I can't beat a 9, I can't beat the flush. This is just going to be an easy fold. Here, under the gun limps. The low jack opens to 10. The cutoff calls. Even though you guys have seen me fold jack queen offsuit several times in early position, even to a limp, you've also seen me open raise with it in late position. Plus, a $10 open is a pretty weak raise. Since I'm currently on the button, I make the call. The blinds fold, but under the gun tags along. The flop comes ace, 10, jack, with 2 clubs and a spade. King, queen flops the nuts. We flop middle pair with a gut shot straight draw. The action checks around to me. I don't have enough information yet with regards to how strong our hand ranks compared to our opponents. This flop is just a tad bit too coordinated, so I check the action back. The turn brings in a 5 of diamonds. Nothing changes. Everyone checks to me for a second time. Okay, time to go for a bit of value. I throw out an incredibly insulting bet of $10 into the $44 pot. All 3 opponents call. The river brings in another 5 of hearts, pairing bottom pair. Everyone checks to me for a 3rd time. Okay, so I can't beat an ace. I chop with a jack. Heck, even a 5 just made trips. I should just check this action back, right? Except, I'm like really greedy when it comes to poker. I think if anyone had an ace or a jack, they would have bet already. Plus, what's the worst that could happen? I chop with another jack? I decide to target that 10 very specifically and throw out a laughable bet of $10 into the $84 pot. Under the gun calls, the low jack calls, and the cutoff folds. I table my hand, and it's good. Guys, I don't make random bets just to bet. My bets usually always have intention and target very specific hands. Here I squeezed out an extra $20 worth of value, betting with what is essentially 3rd pair against 3 other players. This is why I'm willing to play certain hands in certain positions, even against a raise that I wouldn't even bother limping with. We're up $522 1 hour and 45 minutes into the session. Here there are 3 limpers in front of me. I'm holding 9-10 offsuit, but since I'm in the cutoff, I make the call. The button and small blind call as well. We go 7-handed to a flop of ace, ace, 5, rainbow. Big blind leads with a pot size bet of 20. Time to get out of here. Jack 5 off is a fold. Here I open to 10 in the middle position with king queen offsuit. Everyone folds and I pick up the blinds. 8-3 suited. We're not playing blackjack, so this is just a fold. For this hand, we're down to 6-handed. The hijack and cutoff limp. The small blind completes. I'm in the big blind with a pair of black jacks. Weird. I could have sworn I just mentioned blackjack in the last hand. My position is bad, I have a vulnerable hand, and there have been several limpers ahead of me, so I raise the action up to 23. If I were first to act, for instance if I were under the gun, I would have only raised this hand to about 15. But for the price of 23, only the hijack calls. The flop comes 5-2-5 with 2 clubs. In a heads-up situation, this is another one of those polarized flops. It'd be really random for my opponent to just wake up with a club draw here, so as is typical for these sorts of flops, I start with a slight down bet to 20 into the $52 pot. Surprisingly, my opponent raises me to 60 with a $500 starting stack. If he has a small overpair to the board, he only has 2 outs, so I want to give him room to continue blasting. Plus, there's no reason why he can't have a 5, so nothing to do here but call. The turn brings in a 6 of clubs. The front door flush gets there. 3-4 makes a straight. Pocket 6s and 5-6 suited both make a boat. Of course, I can only check. My opponent throws out a meager bet of 40. Either he's afraid of the flush, or he's just boated up. I'm not about to fold for that price though, so again, I make the call. The river brings in a 10 of spades. That shouldn't change anything. If I were holding pocket 10s here instead of pocket jacks, I might consider leading huge on this river with an overbet to target smaller boats, a straight, or the flush. But since I don't in fact have pocket 10s, I check yet again. Thankfully, my opponent checks the action back. I table my hand, and my opponent turns over the good old-fashioned deuce 4 offsuit for a flop bottom pair. Wow, I guess he was really trying to milk ultra-thin value out of a hand like ace high or something. With such a hand, I would have just folded to his raise on the flop. This is why if you want to learn how to properly squeeze out thin value, you need to watch more of my videos. Jack 6 is a fold, ace 8 off. Here I open to 15 in the cutoff with Jack Queen of hearts. Only the small blind calls. The flop comes Jack 10 5 with 2 clubs. We flop top pair with the decent kicker and a backdoor straight draw. Small blind checks. This is an incredibly wet dynamic board. There are multiple straight draws as well as the obvious flush draw. Let's find out if our opponent has any of that. I start with a stale half pot c-bet of another 15, and our opponent just folds. Here under the gun opens to 10. I call in the middle position with 8-9 of diamonds. Small blind, the action player, goes all in for about 200. Alrighty then, time to move on. 3-5 is a fold. Here under the gun limps. The cutoff raises to 15. Small blind calls. Even though they're suited, queen deuce is not worth defending. I fold in the big blind. The very next hand, the middle position opens to 15. It's not worth defending queen 5 of diamonds in the small blind. Here there's an under the gun straddle. Middle position opens to 25. So king 9 off, even on the button, is just a fold. 6 deuce, 5-8 in the big blind facing a raise, 4-6 suited in the small blind facing a large button raise, queen 5, king 3, king 2. Here I open to 8 under the gun with jack 9 of clubs. Everyone calls. We go 6-handed to flop of 3, 10, ace, rainbow. We don't flop anything whatsoever. The action gets checked around to the cutoff, who bets 25. Time to move on. Jack deuce. Here the hijack limps. I complete in the small blind with 5-8 of clubs. The big blind checks. The flop comes 10, 3, king, rainbow. The action checks around. The turn is a 5 of hearts, putting 2 hearts on board. I lead for $5 into the $9 pot, and I just take it down. The action is winding down, and the table has been short for a while now. Here I open to 10 on the button with ace deuce of diamonds. Only the small blind defends. The flop comes king, jack, deuce with 2 spades and a club. We flop bottom pair and not a whole lot else. Small blind checks. I start with a tiny down bet to $5 to see if our opponent has anything, and he makes the call. The turn is a 7 of spades, completing the front door flush. When he checks, there's no point betting here, so I just check the action back. The river is a 5 of hearts. We do not improve. Small blind leads for a half pot bet of 15. We don't beat anything. Even the flush draw got there, so I just make the fold. 3-4, 5-10, 6-7. For this hand, we've gained a player, so we're 7-handed now. Here, I stare down at pocket aces for the second time tonight. A lot of low-stakes players like to limp with these sorts of hands. They're hoping for someone else to do the dirty work for them. But that only works on aggressive tables, and usually not when the table is down to short-handed. On call-heavy tables, I prefer to just come out raising big, so I decide to open for 20. Only the cutoff calls. He's the opponent who called our $23 raise earlier with deuce 4 offsuit. So the flop comes 6, 6, 8 with 2 spades. Wouldn't you know it? It's another small paired board. I start with an absolutely abysmal down bet of $10 into the $44 pot. Our opponent doesn't fall for our ruse this time and just folds. In summary, when the board is small and paired, on boards where our opponent is unlikely to have connected, I like to lead really small. I can do it with trips, complete air, or even over pairs. You can get a sense of how strong your opponent's hand is based on how they react to your bet. 3-9, ace 3 off, 6-9 suited facing a $15 raise, jack 3 suited, ace 3 off, queen 3 suited, 6-3 off. At the 3-hour mark, I rack up my chips and head to the cage. In for 500 and out for 1138 for a delectable profit of $638 after 3 hours of playtime. So there you have it. Every single hand played in a single session. Unadulterated, no hands left out. This was a massive endeavor to feature so many hands in a single session. So I hope you guys appreciate the efforts that my wife and I put into this vlog. I'm going to try to feature more 1-3 vlogs from now on, as I've come to realize that most of my audience plays in those leagues. So if you guys want to continue to learn how to crush low stakes, no limit hold'em, then please like, subscribe, and share my videos. Don't forget to check out my Patreon if you're looking for one-on-one coaching or to simply watch more of the coaching series. And as always, I hope to see you in the next video.